Hello everyone and welcome to the Google Hangout. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Maya Adam and I teach at Stanford University on child health and nutrition, and I'm very excited to be here today to talk to you about the new World Health Organization sugar recommendations. I'm here with some amazing faculty at Coursera. Jenny Walachow is sitting beside me and Alex Sarlin is behind the scenes, and so they're going to remind me if I forget to mention anything. But what I'd like to do today is to talk about what these new guidelines are, to give you some practical tips on how to implement them, how to kind of gently take steps in the right direction towards meeting these guidelines while still maintaining our enjoyment of the food we're eating. And then I'm going to leave most of the time on today's Hangout open to answer your questions. And we're going to do that using the Q&A app. So on the event page, you'll see a Q&A button, and you can just click on that button and type your question in there if you have one. And you can also upvote questions that you'd like to hear answered. So we're going to get started. In March of 2014, in March of this year, the WHO announced some new sugar guidelines. And in 2002, the old guidelines basically stipulated that 10%, not more than 10% of our daily energy intake should be coming from sugar, free sugar. And I'll tell you what they mean by that in just a minute. The new guidelines kept that recommendation, but they added some language in there where they said that there could be some health benefits associated with lowering our sugar intake even further to 5% or less of our daily energy intake. So if we think of the average adult and we look at somebody who's consuming around 2,000 calories a day, 5% of that is 100 calories. And then if we divide that by 4, we get the grams. That takes us to 25 grams. And finally, if we divide that again by 4, we get to around 6 teaspoons of sugar. So that is the recommendation at present from the World Health Organization. We should not be eating more than 6 teaspoons of free sugar. Okay, so what is free sugar? Well, in the language of the document of the guidelines, free sugar is anything that is added to sweeten, for example, by us or by food manufacturers. They're talking about simple sugars like table sugar, sucrose, but also naturally occurring sugars found in things like honey and syrup, fruit concentrates, and even fruit juice. But fruit, whole fruit, is not included in those 6 tablespoons of sugar. Okay, so now that we've got that out of the way, let's talk about why these guidelines came about. Why now? And the simple answer is we're eating too much sugar. I know this is true. I'm guilty as well. I haven't yet met the new guidelines, and I'm going to tell you what I'm doing to get closer to meeting those guidelines. But since the 1950s, our sugar intake has increased by about 40%. And eating too much sugar puts us at risk for a whole host of diseases, including obesity and overweight, but also including diseases that are follow-ons from those. For example, things like diabetes, things like heart disease, and a whole host of chronic diseases that really threaten our long-term enjoyment of our lives and our longevity. So another reason that these recommendations came about was the fact that there were concerns about dental health. A lot of children are suffering from cavities around the world, and this is something that we can reduce the risk of if we reduce our sugar intake. And finally, there's some evidence to suggest that even independently of obesity, too much sugar messes with our insulin responsiveness, so we can become a little bit insensitive to insulin if we eat too much sugar on a regular basis. So these are the reasons why we have these new guidelines, and I think most people are in agreement that they're certainly telling us to move in the right direction. So now, what can we do about this? Well, first, we need to understand the math, and math has never been my strong point. I struggle when my 4th grader is reviewing his times tables. I struggle to make sure he's on the right track, but this part I can get. So if we have a number of grams, like we're reading a nutrition label and we see that there are 25 grams of sugar in that product, what we can do simply to understand how many teaspoons of sugar that is, we divide by 4. So let's say I picked up a can of Italian soda the other day just to see how much sugar was in there. 32 grams of sugar in that one soda. And so I divided in my head by 4 and I got to 8. Am I right there, Jenny? Okay, she's checking on me. So we're at 8 teaspoons of sugar in that one soda. If I wanted to know the calories in that soda, I would take the 32 grams and multiply it by 4 because there are 4 calories in every gram of sugar. So that would give me 128 calories of sugar. So I think that's the first step, knowing how to calculate from a nutrition label how many teaspoons of sugar you're eating. After that comes awareness. I would say take a week, if you haven't done this already, and just look at what you're eating. Read the labels of the foods you're eating. I opened my refrigerator and took out my favorite organic fruit on the bottom yogurt that I love eating. I turned it around and looked at the label, and boy oh boy, that thing had 24 grams of sugar in it, in the one little yogurt. Divide by 4, there's my 6 teaspoons of sugar just at breakfast. So awareness is big. You can overdose on sugar in many, many ways, and we'll talk about that. But I think just knowing where we consume our sugar is a really powerful thing to be aware of. And then I think the next step for me is to find ways to slowly cut back, slowly. And what I mean is, I am guilty of still putting a spoon of sugar, or I was until a few weeks ago, in my coffee. Now, these days, I started for 1 week, I put 3/4 of a teaspoon of sugar in my coffee. Now I'm down to 1/4 of a teaspoon of sugar in my coffee, and I think I'll stay put with that for a while. But the nice thing that happens is that you actually become more sensitive to the sugar that's in your food if you gradually lower it. And you actually can taste that 1/4 of a teaspoon of sugar better than you could before when you were routinely putting in a full teaspoon of sugar. Okay, so once we've started that, I think another recommendation that I would say is just as much as possible, and this goes along with our mission and our course on Coursera, as much as possible, if you can cook at home, you maintain the control when you cook at home. So you're the one that decides exactly how much sugar goes into that thing that you're baking, and that's a fantastic way of knowing exactly how much sugar you're taking in. Another thing you can do is try and avoid processed food, because what happens when we eat a lot of processed food is that we really lose track of the amount of sugar we're taking in. I see that we're being joined by a bunch of new people. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. It's lovely to have you with us. I'm Maya Adam, the instructor of the Stanford Child Nutrition and Cooking MOOC on Coursera, and we're just discussing the World Health Organization new sugar guidelines that telling us that we should not be eating more than 6 teaspoons of sugar every day. And those are ambitious guidelines, let me tell you. I've just admitted to everyone that I have on occasion violated that in the first half of the day, and I think it's easier to do than people realize. I'm just gonna have a quick sip of water and then I'm gonna continue. No sugar water is a good beverage because, you know, those sodas, a single can of soda can contain 8 to 10 teaspoons of sugar in it, and there you go, there's your sugar for the day. So another thing I want to say here is that we can do this gradually. If you have a love of chocolate croissants and you cannot start your day without a chocolate croissant, try having half of a chocolate croissant. It will satisfy your craving and it will have the amount of sugar that you eat on that day. If we make slow, stepwise changes in the right direction, those can be really powerful changes. As I mentioned, these guidelines really are ambitious, and if you've already met them, I take my hat off to you because it's really pretty hard to do. For the rest of us, I think progressive shifts away from processed foods. And one of the reasons we're so concerned about processed food having a lot of hidden sugar in it is that sugar adds shelf life. So a lot of even packaged breads and many packaged goods have corn syrup added to them to maintain the shelf life, and they're more likely to sell. Sweeter goods sell better. So processed food manufacturers obviously have their profit margin in their sights, and that's an important goal for them. Whereas when we cook for our children, we have the long-term health of our children in our sights. And so that's something that's going to change the amount of sugar in the food just by way of the differences in priorities. One thing I want to end with before I open it up to questions is this concept of not vilifying any one food. Anytime we target one single nutrient, like we did with fats in the 80s and 90s, where suddenly everything in the grocery store shelf was fat-free, and what happened was we compensated somewhere else. So processed food manufacturers started adding in a lot more sugar to our food to compensate for the flavor loss by taking out the fat. And we, in our diets, started consuming too much sugar, maybe inadvertently, because we thought sugar was okay, it was the fat we had to worry about. We have to be careful not to do the same thing with sugar now, because sugar, in fact, is not a toxin. It's something our bodies do need in small amounts. Sugar feeds our brain cells, sugar helps us to have energy in our bloodstream. But at the same time, we're eating too much of it. So if we can do this in a way that's positive, that doesn't scare our children away from any single food, and if we can do it in a way that involves moderation, rather than saying we're going to cut out all sugar and instead we're going to eat bacon and drink a cup of cream with it for breakfast, then I think we really get into territory that's going to support our health in the long run. So now what I'd like to do is ask you for your questions. I will read them out. I see one question coming up from Victoria. She's asking me about fructose. Is eating too many fruits high in fructose, like grapes, bad for you? I think in general, Victoria, thank you for that great question. A lot of the research shows that we are actually not eating enough fruits and vegetables, fresh fruits and vegetables in our diets, especially our children. So I think, and the World Health Organization doesn't include whole fruits in their calculation of those 6 teaspoons of sugar. So in general, I would say whole fresh fruits, you really don't need to limit those so much. What you do need to be careful with are fruit juices, because even pure fruit juices can contain up to 8 to 10 teaspoons of sugar. Surprisingly, I know. And it's so easy to drink that quickly when you're thirsty. It's so easy for our children to be drinking juice throughout the day and over-consuming sugar in that way. And I'm just looking about, and the next question is from Ginger. Ginger's asking, what about honey? Honey is a wonderful way to sweeten things, but it is also, it does have simple free sugars. So honey would count towards your 6 teaspoons of sugar a day, but there are other things in honey that might make you want to consider using honey instead of sugar. For example, if you have children with seasonal allergies, a teaspoon of honey can actually make those allergies better, because if it's locally sourced honey, it may have certain pollens in it that desensitize them to the allergens. So honey can be a great way to add a little bit of sweetness to your food. It also, usually we use honey when we're cooking at home, which is another reason why it's a good choice. The next question is about maple syrup. Is it okay to have once in a while? Absolutely. Everything is okay to have once in a while. And if you add a little bit of maple syrup to your homemade, whatever it is, low sugar pancakes or low sugar crepes, you really do not have to be afraid of that. But I think it's all about the amount and it's all about the frequency, just like everything we've been talking about today. Do we have other questions here? I'm looking for the next questions, having a little sip of my unsweetened water here. Okay, the next question, what about artificial sweeteners? Isabelita, that is a great question. Is stevia, Laura's also asking, is stevia really bad for our bodies? And what's my view on natural 0-calorie sweeteners? So this is really a twofold question. we have these natural sweeteners like stevia, and then we have what people consider to be the more artificial sweeteners like equal and those sorts of things. And I think in general we have to be wary of anything that falsely triggers our sweet receptors on our tongue to think they're getting a lot of sugar, because almost all, the natural and the artificial, the 0-calorie sweeteners are usually quite a bit sweeter than regular sugar. So when we consume these, and we tend to consume them more freely because we consider them to be 0 calories, so we think they're free. So when we drink, for example, diet soda, or when we put lots of stevia in our tea, it actually sort of habituates our taste buds to a relatively high level of sweetness. And that undermines us when we then try and use less sugar in, let's say, the cake we're baking, or less sugar in the coffee we're drinking. If we're going to be putting real sugar in, we'll be less likely to taste that normal amount of sugar because of the fact that our sweet receptors have been upregulated by the artificial sweetener. So I would say rather have a small amount of sugar or a small amount of honey and try and wean yourself down rather than going the artificial sweetener route. Our next question, brown sugar versus white sugar. Is brown sugar considered a healthier alternative? Great question. So there are many different kinds of sugar. I'm sure you've seen coconut sugar, brown sugar, white sugar, beet sugar, all the different kinds of sugar. And basically, they are all sources of mono and disaccharides, so simple, free sugars. But some of them are less processed and have other things in them that might be good for us. For example, coconut sugar. If you buy raw coconut sugar, it is less processed than the white table sugar that we usually see, and so that can have some minerals in it and some other things that you might like. Some people prefer the taste of brown sugar because it adds kind of a caramel type taste. So in general, I hate to say it, sugar is sugar, but there are some sugars that are less refined and that have other things in them that might be beneficial for our health in other ways. Okay, next question. How many spoons of sugar is recommended in a cup of tea or coffee? Neil, that is a great question. And I have to tell you, I am so proud of myself because this morning I had a cup of coffee with 1/4 teaspoon of sugar, and it tasted really good to me. It was fine. I didn't miss the sugar, but it's taken me 3 weeks to get there because I am slowly weaning myself off of I used to put a teaspoon of sugar in my coffee. Having said that, I know people who have gotten used to a lot more sugar in their coffee, and it's very hard to cut back dramatically in one go. So I would say wherever you are, try tomorrow morning to have 3/4 of whatever it is you're putting in your coffee, and then wean it down with each week. Go 1/4 teaspoon less until by the end of it, you might not even need any sugar in your coffee. That's my goal. We'll see if I ever get there. I'll let you know. Okay, is there any easier way to calculate the amount of sugar intake per day? Or do we have to measure and remember all of the amount? Amy, that's a great question. I'm just going to go over my math again here because I'm quite proud of my simple formula. So if we, for example, pick up a box of cereal and we're going to feed it to our children, and God forbid it says on that box that in each serving there are 24 grams of sugar. Believe it or not, there are cereals out there that have that much sugar and more in them. If we then look at that 24 grams, that number, I kind of think, at the beginning, I think, well, what does that mean in terms of the teaspoons? It's very easy. If we want to find the number of teaspoons, you just divide by 4. So you take those 24 grams on the nutrition label, divide by 4, and you have 6 teaspoons of sugar in that one serving of cereal. Might make you want to think twice, right? Another way to change things around is if you want to calculate the calories from sugar, you just multiply by 4 because there are 4 calories in each gram of sugar. So you take your 24 and you multiply by 4 to get the number of calories. I would say that's probably the easiest way if you want to calculate. If you're the kind of person that just says, you know what, I'm just going to be conscious about eating a bit less sugar, I bet you'll have just as much success as those of us that are sitting there with our pocket calculators typing in the numbers. Okay, next question is coming up on my screen. Why would I put honey in my salad dressing? That's a good question. Why do I put something sweet in some of the foods that I cook? And why don't I try and balance it with more spices like pepper and chili? Great question. Okay, so in general, I think cooking is a very personal thing because it's almost like art, right? When you're doing a painting, you do things by way of what inspired you. So I was inspired in my cooking by the way my mother cooked, by the way both of my grandmothers cooked, my German grandmother and my Indian grandmother, and certainly my Indian grandmother emphasized using a lot of spice in order to add flavor to food so that we could lower the amount of salt and the amount of sugar that we put in our foods. And my German grandmother, you know, she used to make cake for breakfast, so I had another sort of influence on that side. But for me, I like to balance flavors in my mouth. So the reason when I make a salad dressing where I put a lot of lemon juice in, for me to add a little bit of sweetness, like a little bit of honey in, that balances the flavors for me and makes it more likely that I'm going to enjoy a beautiful salad instead of running to the local pizza joint and eating a pizza for my meal. So for me, it's about sort of making better choices. I don't think there are any foods that are inherently unhealthy. It's always a question of what would you be eating instead? So if I need to add a little bit of honey into my salad dressing so that I can enjoy a great salad for dinner, for me that's a better choice than going to a pizza place and getting a pizza for my dinner that I didn't make from scratch, besides the fact that my little gluten-free child wouldn't be able to eat with me. Okay, so I hope that answers your question. I know everybody has a different way of cooking, and you should go with your gut. My message is that cooking in general is good for us on many levels. It's good for our family's health, it's good for our togetherness, it's good for our enjoyment of food, and any way you like to cook, any flavors you like to add, go with that and really just have fun with it. Next question, how to make sweet desserts such as ice cream and cakes that are still good for our kids' health? Excellent question. Okay, so let's talk about that. When I bake now, and I've always done this, but now I'm even more aware of it since these guidelines came out, I tend to try and just use less sugar than the recipe calls for. If the recipe calls for a cup of sugar, I'll use 3/4 of a cup, or even nowadays I'm trying to head towards half of what the recipe recommends. Another way to make things that are appealing is you can use fruit. So for example, you can take overripe bananas and mash them up and make a nice banana cake that's sweetened a lot with the sweetness of the bananas, such that you might not even have to add any other sugar, or maybe just a tablespoon or two. Also, when you're baking, if you add things like vanilla essence, vanilla tricks the senses into thinking what you're eating is sweet because the aroma of vanilla makes us think about sweet things. So if you add a little bit of vanilla essence or other nice flavors, that's very satisfying and can lead to kind of that nice feeling in your mouth that you're having a treat. Okay, we've got a few more questions coming up. I'd say 4 more minutes of questions, I'm being told from the people on my right here. The next question is, does the teaspoon guideline include simple carbs from bread, pasta, etc.? Lisa, that's a great question. It's a great question, Lisa, because you're right. When we eat like a very refined white bread, that quickly converts to sugar in our bloodstream. You're absolutely right. But according to the World Health Organization recommendations, they are talking about added sugars. So on, let's say, the bread that you're buying, if you're buying some processed bread in a package, read the nutrition label and see how many grams of sugar have been added to that bread. In general, the guidelines are talking about free sugars, so added sugars. But you're right that carbohydrates, especially when they're refined carbohydrates, do convert to sugar relatively quickly when we eat them. So we don't want to overeat those either, whether they're mentioned or not specifically in the guidelines. Our next question is, what other names does sugar have? Sorbitol, maltitose, oh, I love it. Okay, you're right, it's an absolute tongue twister, right? Sugar can come in many different forms. If you see on a label corn syrup, glucose syrup, if you see evaporated cane juice, if you see any kind of honey or syrup or anything that sounds to you like it could possibly be sugar, it's likely going to be sugar. So there are many different names for it, and we have to keep our eyes open for that. The one place where they can't change the name of sugar is on the nutrition label. So that's a safe place to look, because any form of sugar needs to be listed there as sugar. So you can really kind of look to that to understand in your packaged foods how much sugar you're getting. What about milk? Is there sugar in milk? Yes, there is naturally occurring sugar in milk, but the World Health Organization is telling us that we don't need to worry about including the natural milk sugars in unsweetened milk in those 6 teaspoons. So in general, a little bit of milk. I know some people have concerns about milk containing hormones, and we can go into that in another Google Hangout, but in general we don't need to worry about the sugar content of unsweetened milk. Chocolate flavored milk, you have to look at the sugar on the nutrition and factor that in. Okay, last question. Where can I find the guidelines to review? If you Google, Carla, the World Health Organization, and you just put in your Google search tab WHO sugar guidelines, you will find a document that, and we can even maybe link it to this Google Hangout so you can click on it, that outlines these new guidelines. So I hope that helps you. I know it's confusing. There are also a lot of good commentaries that have come out discussing whether these guidelines are realistic, whether they might turn people off completely, or so there's interesting reading out there. Okay, so we can now start. What are we doing now, Jenny? She's going to tell me what we're doing. We are going to start to wrap up now. Thank you very much for joining us. It's been really, really great, and I hope that you will keep this in mind. Remember, the most important thing is that we enjoy our meals. Food is a wonderful thing that brings us together. The occasional sweet treat, if we have it on the weekends or we have it for birthday parties, is absolutely fine. It's all about moderation and making sensible decisions. I know we all, as parents, have a certain amount of common sense that we approach our decisions with, and I think if we rely on our own common sense, we'll end up making really good decisions about how much sugar to feed our children. So thank you very much for joining us. Please visit us on Coursera and keep on learning. I hope we'll be bringing out new modules soon, and I look forward to seeing you there. Thank you very much.